5 million kids per year before the age of 5, 300,000 mothers in childbirth every year. Tragic facts that we've somehow come to accept.
We are afraid that this human man-made crisis would snowball the country into a larger epidemic than the corona is what I fear.
COVID now really scares us, and we are taking massive and drastic measures now that may actually make those regular mortalities worse.
I feel like there's a kind of a fever. Lockdown, lockdown, lockdown. But we are aware that the structures in Africa will not support such kind of lockdowns.
When coronavirus emerged in December in China, it spread via the high-speed rail links. So the first Chinese response was to close down internal travel and then lock down Wuhan. They dampened other fires with aggressive testing and tracing. A lesson quickly learned by South Korea, which stifled its epidemic without even closing schools. But by that time, the virus had spread following the movement of people along airline routes. Too late were borders shut down. With large elderly populations, the US and Europe imposed much more comprehensive lockdowns to ease pressure on intensive care units and to buy time to build testing capacity. So now it is the turn of South Asia, Africa and Latin America, home to most of the world's poor. The dilemma leaders here face is whether approaches used by the wealthy nations, especially lockdowns, will make things better or worse.
It is between the rock and the hard place. It is crucial for Africa to implement strong preventive measures. If we get a catastrophic epidemic like Italy, we do not have the infrastructure to cope with so many patients. But other diseases that are rampant in Africa are still there. If ignored, it can bring back some of the diseases that have been long under control.
It's quite difficult to think about life and death in the context of costs and benefits because we don't like to weigh up people's lives in the balance against anything. Unfortunately, that is what public health decisions imply.
I think we need to bring out the alternatives. We need to put them in numbers as well, difficult as it is to put learning in children and competing mortality from malaria, pneumonia, and maternal deaths against deaths in severe disease in vulnerable and elderly groups to COVID. But we need to provide some alternative as to these countries and governments that have to make these difficult decisions.
What we're seeing at the moment in the African region is an attempt to apply a measure that was devised for the cost-benefit analysis of a different part of the world.
Lockdowns forcing people to stay at home are supposed to stop people moving. But in low-income countries, the opposite has happened. In Africa and India, 80% of people work informally, earning from hand to mouth. Hungry people will move to find food for themselves and their children. On March 24, with the virus already in some cities, both India and South Africa announced stringent lockdowns, not wanting to allow time for people to move around. India's Prime Minister gave only 4 hours notice and cancelled all public transport. This backfired.
These images remind me of the partition days when India and Pakistan were bifurcated into two countries, and you had lakhs of people walking down the streets with their belongings, with their families. Already central India is having a temperature of around 38 degrees. So people are facing a lot of hardships.
Such scenes of mass migration are a public health disaster in terms of containing the epidemic. Those on the Breadline voted with their feet.
बीमारी से मरना मंजूर है लेकिन भूख से मरना मंजूर नहीं है। दिन भर में कभी एक रोटी मिल जाती, कभी दो रोटी मिल जाती, कभी थोड़ा सा चावल मिल जाता है। इसमें कैसे गुजारा हो?
The government has food stockpiles and has made promises. No one will go hungry. But how do you get food to the people who need it when most of the poor are not registered for state aid? And food handouts like this risk spreading the virus. Across Africa, the same fear of hunger is also deep-rooted.
Coronavirus yakuzokhala tsono times 2 chifukwa anthu ambiri dziko lathu kuno kupeza wake
kuti ndama zapereka bwanji mwezi ukatha ife tizitivuta kuti ndama tizipeza bwanji siku kuti pasikhomo potizidya chani
chimodzimodzi timachita kuno kuti ine kungodwala malungo okhala 1 week kuchipatala nkazama kakhumata pambalipa nkumakufusaso kuti kunyumba kulibe chakudya koma munthu ali pa bedi.
For us, we know what hunger can do. We might not know as much as what the virus can do, but we've had the experience of hunger. We know what hunger can do. We know that it can kill, and it has been doing so even in the best times of our economy, in the best times of our lives. In the Ugandan capital, Kampala, a partial lockdown is in place. People can walk around in the day, but there is no public transport and businesses have closed, so people don't have work. They are walking large distances around the city to buy cheaper food.
I don't have enough food. You say I'm traveling by food to go and buy food at a cheap price. Yeah. Suppose I could be buying it at a normal price there, I could not be moving. So we don't have enough food.
With jobs in the city closed down, there is a danger of a repeat of the scenes from India. Believe me, that will be our immediate reaction, to pack up and go back home to the villages. Because at least back in the village, you can go to the farm, to the field, and you'll pick up some vegetables and cook them. The exodus from cities poses a real danger to elderly people, most of whom live in the villages.
If we look at our demographics, we find that most of the elderly who are vulnerable to this infection mainly live in the rural areas. And once it gets there, they will be the ones at risk.
In Malawi, most of us, when we get older, we usually move back home to go and live amongst our close family and friends, for them to take care of us, we go back where we came from.
If you're a slum dweller in a poor city, you don't have soap and water to wash your hands in your community or let alone at home, and you're all cramped into one room. I think then we're missing some of the ingredients to slow transmission of the virus. I think we need to remember that the overall objective is unfortunately only to slow down the virus to a rate where health services and societies can cope. I think we've passed the threshold of stopping the epidemic altogether.
In Europe, the main reason for lockdowns is to flatten the curve of the epidemic and relieve pressure on the intensive care unit beds, to make sure there are enough ventilators for those who need them. But in most African hospitals, the only ventilators are those found on the ceilings.
The worse the healthcare system, the fewer hospital beds there are, the lower the benefit of flattening the curve. And so when you do that cost-benefit analysis, the costs of implementing the lockdown measures start to massively outweigh the benefits of flattening that curve.
The risk of lethal consequences of COVID-19 goes up sharply with age, especially after the age of about 65. Only 3% of Africans make it to the age of 65. In Europe, the median age is 42. Africa is by far the world's youngest continent, with a median age of just 18.
In Africa only, 3% are over 65 years old. India has 6% over 65. Europe has 20%. This makes COVID a much greater threat to rich countries. However,
Elderly people in Africa will be at greater risk of catching COVID-19 because they usually live in multi-generational households.
Where it's a challenge, African culture is such that the elderly are taken care by their children. So the elderly usually live with the family.
It may be there are some common African and Indian diseases which would also make COVID-19 more dangerous, like TB. This is being studied, but as yet there is no evidence. Malnutrition is another potential danger. It increases risk of severe pneumonia in children. Some have voiced fears that COVID-19 may be more dangerous for malnourished people. But again, lockdowns will make things worse by creating the very hunger you want to avoid. People with other conditions like diabetes, high blood pressure, and cardiovascular disease are more at risk of dying from COVID-19. But these conditions are less prevalent in Africa than in wealthy countries. There have been fears that younger Africans could be in greater danger because of HIV. But the good news is that a growing body of evidence from Europe is showing that people living with HIV are not in danger of developing more serious COVID-19 symptoms. The real danger for those with HIV is if treatment and testing services are disrupted. Every year, 5 million children under 5 die worldwide, mostly from preventable causes. They die of malaria, sepsis, diarrhea, pneumonia, and many other causes. And when there is an economic downturn and parents are struggling to put food on the table, these figures go up sharply.
As UNICEF, we're quite concerned about what we call the collateral impacts of the lockdown measures that are being taken across poor countries and low resource settings now. We look back at historical experiences. We did an estimate of Sierra Leone during Ebola and the disruption of health services during Ebola times in Sierra Leone during 1 year. We estimated cost as resulted in 5,000 under fives dying.
The other diseases still need attention. We have medical emergencies. When they have malaria, quite a number of children go into convulsions. We have got these childhood diseases, and these need immunization, not to forget HIV/AIDS. So all of these, while we are in this crisis, must go on.
We're scrambling to save the lives of old and vulnerable people, which is what we should be doing. But the ones who will be bearing the big cost are actually the children and the coming generations. In the more immediate, hunger, lack of social protection, exposure to violence, and whatnot. And then down the line through the economic depression that is resulting from these measures.
We like to say that we would lay our lives down for our children. When we are faced with a choice between the lives of elderly and the lives of younger people, we are in fact making the choice to shift the burden, the mortality burden, from older populations in wealthier regions to younger populations in poorer regions.
And what about children's education? For many in the developing world, education of their children is the way out of poverty. It is not a luxury, but a crucial future investment for which people struggle hard, spending all their extra income. Take away that income, and how many of these children will be able to go back to school again? Finally, what is likely to be the impact on freedoms that governments should be protecting? In many places, police have used force to impose the lockdowns.
The moment violence and force is used, in the days of social media, everyone can see it. public confidence in the police and in the military skydives. Nobody becomes interested in listening, and suddenly you find yourself with big protests, mass gatherings, and of course these mass gatherings are just cesspits for the spread of COVID-19.
So, might there be less harmful alternatives to slow the spread of the virus? Modeling work shows that physical distancing, hand washing and other measures, which would allow most economic activities to continue, will make a big difference. Another way of slowing the epidemic will be to stop all movement of people between areas inside countries, but continue to allow movement of goods. Inside each area, people would continue to work, earn and produce, but they could not move geographically. Boundaries between districts could also be closed down. This would make it easier to isolate any outbreak. Over time, it would create a series of smaller spikes, rather than one large epidemic that sweeps a whole country. While South Africa has opted for lockdown, in Zambia they have stopped all movement between the provinces and the capital, Lusaka. But inside the capital, businesses have remained open.
We implemented a geographic lockdown, geographic methods of flattening the curve rather than locking down the whole country. They could not completely lock down the place because majority of the population is very poor, and so that would have then impacted negatively on their daily lives, and that ultimately would have led to a hunger situation.
One of the biggest challenges is how to protect the elderly when all generations often live in the same tiny house. According to predictions made by computer models, introducing physical distancing for the elderly is one of the measures which would save most lives. But how could you do this in city slums?
If we are serious about protecting the elderly and the immunocompromised people in the townships and in the slums, why don't we put them in the hotels? Hotels are standing empty at this time. We have a unique opportunity to protect the vulnerable. Let's use it.
There is the same problem in villages. George Abongonera spent years working in northern Uganda, setting up HIV services in hard-to-reach areas. He says it should be possible to protect the elderly if communities are given the correct information.
One of the lessons we learned is that the answers are in the community. In Africa, the elderly are respected because they have lived such a long life in some communities. They're really valued people. So if the community is aware and they all agree that this is something that is at risk, that will put their wiser population at risk, and they want to keep them safe, they will devise means around creative ways of social distancing.
Sharifa has for years been a community organizer in Malawi. She is currently in Glasgow, the UK, doing a PhD. But from there, she has been able to call the village leaders she knows in Malawi and warn them about the problem they face.
It's all right to share with communities and explain to them what the problem is. To say what we need to do is keep this distance, keep our elderly safe. We need to do this. But the how do we achieve this needs to come in part in negotiation with the communities, in negotiation with the people who are going to be doing it, because they know their lifestyles, they know how they live in that community.
So in this village, an hour outside the capital, they are getting ready after the community leader received a long phone call from Sharifa. Old people here tend to live with the grandchildren who look after them. The grandchildren are now being moved out and are learning how to safely prepare food for their grandparents.
Achikulilewa titawafikira kudzera mautengo siyana kuti mwina tiwauze nene kuti nthenda ayi kwenikweni yokanga tiyang'ana akuluakulu kwambiri. Kumbali ya kakhalije sitionena kuti kucheza pakati pathu kwatha ndi agogo ayi. Kucheza kulipo ndithu, koma timaonetsetsa kuti pamene tikucheza nawo tionetsetse kuti pali mtunda osachepera 2 meters.
This example shows that what people need is information from sources they trust, even if it is by mobile phone from the other side of the world. So there needs to be a mass education campaign, for which some of the present messaging may need to change.
Troubling images of large groups of young people seemingly ignoring coronavirus guidelines.
In some places, in an effort to get young people to take the epidemic seriously, it has been emphasized that everyone can be killed by the virus, no matter their age.
Nobody's immune to this. Millennials are not immune to this.
So young people are as frightened as the elderly.
How old are you?
I'm 16 years old.
You fear dying of corona?
Of course I fear. I fear.
The message does not help in galvanizing people to protect those most vulnerable. If everyone is at risk, why try to separate off the elderly?
I think objectively, if you put numbers on this, crossing the street in an African city is probably the most dangerous thing you can do if you're a young person. And if you're an under 5, you need to be much more worried about malaria, pneumonia, and newborn deaths, etc. And if you're a pregnant woman, you should be worried about your delivery. And those are the real risks. They're always the risks, and they are still the biggest risks. Conversely, if you're 75 years or 85 years or older, you should be very worried about COVID. And if you have a heart condition or diabetes or something, you should also be very worried.
Finally, responses need flexibility.
Each country, each geographic region needs to look at their setup before they can implement anything. And that in as much as everyone's trying to control the spread, some of the measures that need to be put in place actually have very, very adverse impacts. And it would even be worse than what COVID would do.
We need to watch very carefully the epidemic as it emerges in Africa and find out local African solutions.
This is new, we're not used to it, and it can affect the people with power, the middle class. It can affect us in Europe, and I think that's what's different. That this time it's about the people in power and the people who communicate rather than the poor buggers who've always been dying and we're used to them dying.
Hopefully, this particular pandemic will show the world that what they are grappling with now, other countries have been grappling with other diseases and haven't had the same attention that this particular one is receiving. 2/3 of all the, say, HIV, tuberculosis is in sub-Saharan Africa, and we've been battling with these diseases for years.
I've spent 20 years of my life arguing that childhood pneumonia, the single biggest cause of killer of children. 800,000 kids died from regular pneumonia last year, and no one has paid much attention. Now here's an irregular, atypical pneumonia killing all sorts of ages. And that actually has opened up an opportunity because suddenly there's resources and we can get oxygen systems out there. We can get amoxicillin, the missing 50-cent antibiotic, out there.
Maybe people could be a bit more humanitarian and realize that the outbreak of the disease in one part of the world should receive utmost attention, not only because of the fear that it might spread to them, but also just because these are people